Hey, what's going on, guys? It is the Master Gamer here, and I want to give you a PSA not to record an entire video on mute. Don't do that. But I'm not uploading a Madden video right now. I am actually I'm coming back and uploading a One Piece deck profile. I've been playing this game a lot. I've been liking it a lot. And I've seen a lot of versions of this deck on the site, and most of them stink, and I just wanted to put up a good one because I've liked this leader a lot. I don't think it gets played nearly as much as it should. He has a lot of value that a lot of leaders don't have access to. And he does really, really well in the fair game states. And obviously, it's a thing that you could say about a lot of decks, but this deck is very consistent. It has a lot of different just good cards, and because of that, it gives you a lot of options to outplay in fair game states against just about any deck. If it doesn't have the nuts draw. That's the one thing that holds this deck back, is it wins in fair game states, but there's certain times you get in unfair game states. It's like, okay, well, I can't play the game. Because Sakazuki is just going to blow up everything on my board, and I don't have any way to counter that. Or Katakuri just drop 10-drop big mobs. To a certain extent, if someone draws the nuts, this deck is not designed to get around that in a best-of-1 game. That is unfortunate. However, it does really, really well into fair game states. And because of that, I think this is a legitimately strong leader. It's not Sakazuki, but it's not weak either. And I've seen this leader not get nearly as much respect as it should. The biggest value of this card over, say, the red-purple Luffy is the 5-life leader for one, and it's a 5/7 with the Dawn minus ability. So having a Dawn minus ability allows access to a lot of other different effects, and the consistency that you have access to it is very, very important. It doesn't require any other setup. It just Dawn minuses itself, and other cards will interact around it. And being able to do that every turn is very good. Your leader is effectively a 5/7, which means when you're swinging, they have to use 2 cards in their hand to block. So it has a really, really nice thing going for it. That's really all there is to say. Let's get into the deck. So the first set of cards we're going to be looking at is the Searchers, which is the Nami and Killer. Killer's going to search for Kid Pirates. Nami is going to search for Straw Hats. Your Kid Pirates are going to be more of the setup cards. They're a bit slower, but they work with the Dawn minuses. The Nami cards are going to be a lot of your rushers, your 2Ks. So you're working with 2 kind of different packages that are really accessible. All keeping in mind really the fact that you're working with 2 or 3 extra Dawn a turn, basically. Not for ramping at all, which is really nice. You're using extra Dawn without ramping, which is kind of crazy. The way I like to think about this deck, and it becomes really apparent with the Searchers, is I like to think of this deck as a hand manipulation deck. I want to be pulling cards in your opponent's hand, draining their resources, and then swinging for 7/8, 7/8, 7/8 consistently to ultimately put too much pressure than they can really handle. So very oftentimes this deck, instead of even playing a card on turn 2, oftentimes I'm swinging 5 and 5 with leader and a Searcher. I value my Searchers late game because, again, I have so much extra Dawn that these cards are actually better than Rush Zoro in a lot of cases. What I mean by that is Zoro costs 3. This card costs 1. It's already going to be on board because no one's going to deal with this card unless it's swung at a pudding or whatever, something that's small on board. If this card's already on board, 2K of the power is already on this card. Zoro is a 3/5. So for 3 Dawn, you can make this card a 5K. And you keep the Zoro in hand. So it effectively saves you resources, especially when you're working in game state where you have extra Dawn, to keep a Zoro in hand and use these guys late game as just beat sticks. It's weird to say it's not unique to these cards. It's not even unique to this deck per se, but because you're working with so much extra Dawn, it comes up a lot more, I found, in this deck than many other decks where you're just swinging with these little guys just by attaching 3 Dawn. And I am a believer in swinging for 5, specifically in this deck, because it's just going to force them to not take the life in a lot of cases because they don't want to. Even yellow sometimes doesn't want to take the 5, so you can use that as a great way of pulling cards from their hand. The next, we're just going to get to 2Ks. Their 2Ks, their searchable 2Ks are Nami. OP06 has a Kid 2K that's pretty good. It's not awesome in this deck as a effect, but there are certain cases where it being able to have some removal is fairly nice, but it'll be thrown in mostly just to balance out my 2Ks. The next card is Wire. Wire's great. Being a low-cost blocker, I don't need to explain the value of that into the late game. He provides some cycle. There's not too much to say here. He's bad in some matchups. He's really good in others. One thing that I don't think I mentioned this time around is that counter is very good in this particular deck. As much as I like to be playing for hand advantage early game into my opponent, I also want to be protecting my life very aggressively early game, even though I benefit at being at 3 life. If I can make it to the late game with 4 life, I will absolutely do it every single time. Having that life advantage in a deck like this is crucial because it allows myself to hit on the crack back and push for game pretty aggressively when I want to. And other times it allows me to clear board pretty safely, knowing that they won't have some kind of insane just rush play on the following turn. Being able to play that safe with a leader like this that has so much extra dawn feels really, really good. Then he's very similar to Wire in that into the Sakazuki matchup, being a 3-cost hurts. In just about every single other matchup, though, this Heat is really, really good. Being able to put 2 6Ks on board late game, it puts so much pressure on your opponent. It's just awesome. If you guys don't know what this card does, it's when you Dawn minus once per turn, this character gains 2k power until the end of your opponent's next turn. So he stays at 6k off turn, which is really nice. It makes him hard to deal with. And he's just a really, really good card for applying pressure. You Dawn -1 and you get 2k power here. You get 2k power in your leader. And if you another one, you get even more. So it becomes multiplicative scaling, which is really where you get your unfair game states. Then for the, not final Kid Pirate, but another Kid Pirate, I don't know, I was going to say final, is this OP01 Kamazo. Card's really good. It's very specific matchup dependent as to where I put it in the deck for. However, you can argue that 4 of this would be great. I have 2 kind of free spots in this deck, and I'll get more to that later. And it could very easily be 2 more of these. This card is really good. Initially, why I put it in the deck was for dealing with Borsalinos and Magellans. So what this card does is on KO, Dawn -1, and KO 5 cost or less. But because it's on KO, that tends to be off turn. That means Magellan effect isn't going to activate, and it means that Borsalino effect isn't going to activate. Obviously, you're still going to be Dawn -1 from the Kamazo in the Magellan case, but 1 is definitely better than 2. And it gets removal off turn. It makes them want to not get rid of this card. So it's kind of sticky in that aspect also. It's just a really, really good card at just floating. It's a really safe floater, deals with blockers off turn. I could see myself running 4 and not batting an eye. This card's very good. Now, the best Kid Pirate in the entire deck, and that should be no surprise, is the 5-cost just Captain Kid. The card's great. It's even better considering this kid is your leader. So every single turn you have access to a Dawn -1. That means you have access to 1 extra Dawn a turn the second this card gets on the field. Just straight up 1 extra Dawn that's active every single turn. With no other setup, just playing this card gets you that ability because your leader has the Dawn -1 built in, which not a lot of purple has access to, which is kind of weird. But here we are. This leader with this kid gets even more value than that card already does, and I don't need to explain how good that card is. Now, coming on next, we have our Rush package. I don't need to explain why I'm playing the Luffy or the Zoro, I think. If anything, I need to talk about why I have less than normal. This initially was a 4-4. Very reasonably was this a 4-4. I found that not having counter, I dislike a lot, especially in this deck. And these guys did not have counter. They became cloggy. I was never playing 2 at a time. If I drew 2 Luffys, I always didn't like it. There was no scenario where I wanted to have 2 Luffys in hand, especially not in the first 75% of a game. These guys are really, really good at pushing for damage and board late game. Early game, they are average at best. I much prefer some of my slower plays than these rushers. but there are instances where you do want to have them. These are mostly for late game, though. For the most part, these are a late game package that's searchable. Being able to put 2 Zoros on board late game and being able to swing 7/7/7 plus something else is very, very good. But early game, throughout the entirety of the time I've played this deck, very, very rarely am I playing out these rushers early game. Then the final, well, not even the final rusher, really, is this Sanji. Now, the Sanji being a 4 of is for one reason and one reason alone. It's this word right here, just counter 1K. That's the only reason. Having access to this counter, and again, it's like beating a dead horse, but I really, really like having extra counter in this deck in particular. Being able to protect life and use the fact I'm a 5 life leader to my advantage feels really, really good in a lot of different matchups. So I play 4 of these cards because he has rush and he has counter, and that's not something that's very common. He's by far the rusher I want to see the most, and it's the reason why I have the most of him. Any scenario where he wouldn't be live, you're winning anyways. And him being a 6 doesn't matter as much because you're working with so much extra Dawn with your Dawn minusing and the 5 Ghost Kid that I really don't feel too bad spending the extra power to get access to that counter. Then we have the 7 Cost Kid, only 3 of them in this particular case. 4 is too cloggy. You don't want to see it early game. It's a little slow late game, so sometimes you don't even want to play it. But having even more access to a Dawn -1 for sequencing and for utilizing extra Dawn, if you get into the late game and you don't even have the 5 Cost Kid, you're just pumping up with this and this. It's effectively giving you 4 Dawn, because this is a 2-for-1 Dawn, and it's using a Dawn that's already been used, and it's coming back next turn. This is using a Dawn that's already been used, and it's giving you a Dawn off, or power off turn. So you're working with extra Dawn by quite a bit. So having these 2 in combination is really, really good. Immediately working with, plus Dawn right there. So that's one thing. Being a 6K off turn, I don't need to explain, that's good. But it is slow, and again, in certain matchups, you don't like to have it. I found now that I've switched to this more defensive style of playing with more counters, and positioning myself for more removal and hand destruction and playing for advantage, this card has gained a lot of its power back. Initially, when I was playing this deck, I found this card to be too slow, and I didn't know when the spots to play it were. At this point in this iteration of the deck, this card feels really safe to play. It does its job very well. It becomes a threat to the opponent, and again, gives you more access to Dawn minus, which is pretty good for some sequencing things. And 10-drop Luffy. He's a good card. He isn't 10-drop Big Mom. He's not that good. But being able to get 2-for-1s and a rush, if they block, gives you a lot of value for the late game. Just dealing with blockers to this degree is absurd for your late game pushes. There isn't a lot of comparable cards that can just deal with cards like Borsa plus like Lucci. It just says, oh, okay, cool, you block, well, now your board's gone. And it gets rid of an 8K, which hits so much in the game. Obviously, it's not going to hit other 10 drops, but just about everything else, it'll be able to target. This card is really, really good in the push for late game. I don't spend too much time on it. It's a 10-drop rusher with destruction every turn. 2 Jake Pistols, removal. Now we have 2 Sheepshorn, and I actually don't think I like Sheepshorn over Top Knot. Like I said earlier, there's 2 card spots that can be changed. These are the 2. You could run Sheepshorn, be fine. You could run Top Knot. I think I actually prefer Top Knot, just give it another way to bottom deck and deal with Borsas. You could also run Kamazos for the same reason. Or you could actually run 2 of the next card, which is the final card of the deck, which is the Gun Gum Giant Sumo Slap. No Rad Beams. Rad Beam is not really live in the way I want to play this deck that often. So I found myself holding Rad Beams too much to maximize value, and it didn't feel great. It just felt like a 1-2K, which, at that point, why am I playing an event for that? And then I just put this card in because I was playing Nami's, and I was like, I want ways to deal with Rebecca's very easily. And this, actually, I found I liked a lot better because it's a 2-for-1, right? So, for instance, very often, you're going to end up with an extra Dawn on board if you want it because of this kid. So very, very frequently, this card will be live without being too much of a tell. If you want to, obviously, like, you can sequence in a way where that's not the case, but if you just sequence in certain ways, you'll have 1 Dawn left over. Because this will be live without the tell. What this card does is it's a 2k counter, and it can also KO a 2k power or less card. That means it pops Rebecca's, that means it pops Sugars, that means it pops Brulees. It hits a lot of these low-cost blockers is really what it's designed to be used for. And it does a really, really good job at that. It doesn't feel nearly as bad to use early game. There's so many more resources that this card deals with than Radbeam. This card is absolutely awesome. I initially threw this card in, and it's like, this is one of those cards that you put in the deck and be like, let's just see if it's good into certain matchups. And oftentimes those cards, like, nah, they're not that practical. This is not one of those times. This card is awesome. Getting rid of, again, Rebecca's small blockers off turn is so, so incredibly nice. And in an absolute worst case, it's a relatively easy to access 2K. That puts you at 10 2Ks, plus just about 3 billion 1Ks in this deck. So you have a lot of different access to protect your life early game and into the late game. This card's really good. I don't know how many red decks will run it, even if it stays around in the next meta, just because this deck has a lot of good access to it. But this deck in particular really, really likes to have access to this card. It's so nice to be able to pop those Rebecca's and small blockers for free off turn when they believe they've set up and they get punished for it. There's also ways to sequence around it, but people are just not anticipating this card because no one in the world plays this card. Because who would play this card over Radbeam? I would. And I don't regret doing it. This card's awesome. So yeah, that's it for this deck profile, guys. This has been my red-purple Eustace Captain Kid leader from ST10. I think it's really good. I don't think he's, that S-tier deck, but he's a solid tier 2 deck that I think deserves a lot more respect than it's gotten. We'll see how it holds up in a Gecko Moria meta. I think it will struggle if that card isn't restricted in any way, but we'll see what happens. It's getting a decent amount of support in OP06 and EB01, so who knows? But as of right now, as we end OP05, I've been liking this leader a lot. So I just want to put that out there. This is the deck. That's all I got. Who knows? Maybe I'll upload more One Piece in the future, but I just wanted to upload this to put something on the platform that I thought was good with this leader.